But it's a delight for us to share together at the beginning of this year. And we do so in the context of many, many challenging experiences. In the context of drought, fire, and rain, and the interaction between all of those things at one and the same time. All around the country, we take notice of unprecedented temperatures. 3 state capitals that have recorded 40 to 45, and it was higher than that yesterday. We had a barbecue in the garden. I don't think we needed the heat for burning anything because we had the heat all around us. We also recognize the life-threatening floods as monsoonal rains drenched Queensland and other parts of the country. Added to that, the threat of coronavirus strain. I need to put that into context because I have heard so many things and I felt, let's get this into context. Some of you may not be familiar with this, but just after the First World War, 200,000 people died of Spanish flu. Put it all into context. The Chinese government and the Chinese people honor them for the integrity that they've shown in the past X period of time. They know it's so important to react in the way they have. And irrespective of what you think, absolutely right, of course, that people are given that opportunity, whether they like it or not, to have those 2 weeks if they arrive back from dangerous places. We recognize that. We recognize also only 4 lives, 4 children, and then 3 more in a party that were part and where alcohol was the cause. Talk nonsense if you like, but that's why those children are no longer with us. Put that into the context, and you say, we are beginning this year in the setting of many, many challenging experiences. The World Health Organization, of course, in relation to the virus, has declared the outbreak a global world health emergency. How do we understand our work? How do we understand our witness? How do we wrestle with the challenges of being who we are at Wesley Mission? Now, there are very few really authentic Methodist services, but there are just 2. One is the Covenant service, and the other, of course, is the Watch Night service, which we don't practice where we are to any great extent. But if you were to go to Pacific Islands, you were to go to other places where that community is strong, you will find that they still, at the beginning of a year, remember. But the Covenant service, this is not the covenant theme that other religious groups have practiced that take you back to particular times. It is authentically Methodist, an understanding of covenant as it was. In the earliest days, 1744, I think, John Wesley decided they have a covenant service on Christmas Day. Now, I've got a feeling that we'd have trouble trying to implement that one so easily in the world in which we live today, but it was a reminder of what commitment is all about. It's a service that has a serious intent. It's a demand upon all people, and so it seems to me appropriate just to take that theme for a few moments, to expand it and to talk about it in the setting in which we find ourselves. The biblical origins in our context are in the Old Testament book of Jeremiah. John Bright, great New Testament scholar, described the biblical passage in Jeremiah as one of the profoundest and most moving passages in the whole of the Bible. The concept of covenant is picked up, of course, in the New Testament in 1 Corinthians chapter that speaks about the Lord's Supper, where we read there, a new covenant in my blood. It's a challenging theme because it makes demands upon us. It's an out of favor theme because today we want to make the Christian faith as easy as we can. We want to make it so that people can embrace it in whatever setting they find themselves and call it their own. The challenge of covenant questions us not only as individuals, but as a community. At the beginning of 1987, I was invited to conduct and preach at a 1-hour BBC One live service on the theme of covenant. The invitation came in October, and we were in that congregation enjoying immense growth. The number of services had to increase, and we saw lots of people coming in. And the producer said to me, "We need the church absolutely full." And that service was to be at 8:30 on a Sunday morning early in the year. The television crew came, and they set up all the cameras and all the work on the Saturday in the church. And it all felt quite good. But I kept hearing the producer's words in my mind, "We need to have the church full." But then, such as can happen, it started to snow. The snow was pretty desperate. It snowed and snowed. We reached 5 inches by early evening, and I kept hearing the producer's words, "We need the church absolutely full," because they wanted to make some kind of statement about the importance of covenant. Now, I arrived early in the morning, 6 in the morning, to see how things were. Difficult even to drive the church to Carter Church. And I was proud and frightened by the fact that lots of the people from church were shoveling snow wherever they could to make it possible to get down the long drive that led to our church. Then one of the cameramen whispered to me, he said, "Catterick's off this afternoon." Now that meant Catterick Racecourse, because all the people that were doing the filming for this covenant service were due to go to the racecourse and film the racing that afternoon. That had been cancelled because of the snow. And for the first time in my life, I was beginning to say, I want to be identified with the racing here, and wanted ours to be cancelled perhaps in the same way. But it was all about covenant. Of course, people came. I think they came out of loyalty as well as the joy of sharing together. And we explored that theme of covenant. We often use it in legal terms. We use it when we put a covenant on a particular property, a building. We use it in many different ways, but that's not quite what Jeremiah is talking about. Nor is it as some of the others talked about from centuries before. It is a covenant of love. A covenant that is not about law, firstly, but about love. That covenant needs to be put into that setting. The prophets of the day were drawing attention to the fact that people were sliding back. There was apostasy. The whole of the community of the time were losing their way. And God was speaking a clear word. We needed to restore, to renew our covenant with God. So, as I think of the covenant as it's expressed in Jeremiah, it's the honesty of its words. It's its ability to bring us up against the truth. And it's the hopeful possibility of a new beginning. Throughout December, Carol and I visited many of our centres and our work with disability-aged young people. In the weeks prior to Christmas, just at a very quick thought, I attended about 20 hot turkey and ham lunches. Now, there's nothing wrong with that. But I need to say there is a limit, and we shared in those meals together. But I remember one a year ago when one of the people who shared together in one of our centres spoke to me. He spoke to me about a book. He was in his 90s. And there he was commending a book to me and giving me a copy. And I thought, this is fantastic to see somebody whose mind is still alert, still ready to explore the Christian faith in so many ways. The book was called The Hope Quotient. He talked about hope. He arrived in Australia from Sri Lanka with his young wife 66 years earlier. He came a number of months before her. He had little money, He started a new life in a very different kind of Australia than the Australia we share today. He was a trained teacher, and he was given a job. He was given a job teaching in a school with 1,200 young people, and he was the only person of colour. Now, let us be honest about the Australia that he came into. That was not easy. But he remembers those days, and he talked about hope. He talked about hope sustaining him. The covenant referred to in Jeremiah picks up this theme of hope and says the way we understand covenant is related to love, and it builds within a community hope. It was a senior pastor of a church who once said, when you say a situation of a person is hopeless, you're slamming the door into the face of God. When I listen to situations about people in prison, when we talk about the work, women and men that we are involved in day by day, we are saying there is hope in our community because of Jesus Christ. There is hope through what we do as we reach out with compassionate care and love into people's lives. 4 things stand out for me when I think of hope that achieve what nothing else can. Hope releases us, first of all, from the negativity of the past. Releases us from what the past can hold us to. It motivates people to bounce back, whatever their circumstance. And hope sets us free to dream for the future and activates the world to be a better place. In business terms, we have used the word in new ways when we've talked about resilience. For resilience is closely bound up with what hope is all about. Think about it in terms of the Bible. Joseph endured mistreatment from a dysfunctional family. One of the greatest biblical narratives, but it's a very painful one if we read it, of the dysfunctionality of those that were around him. David bounced back from devastating personal failure in what has to be a very adult story. And Peter in the New Testament was disappointed by his own failures. So when we declare that we believe in a covenant of love, it begins to break through and break into all those various different circumstances of people's lives. When we consider the ministry of Jesus and we observe him being let down by others, even those closest to him at moments of greatest need, we share together at the outset of a new Wesley mission year. We recognize both as individuals and a world context that perhaps like never before we've needed a message of hope. You know that cities of the world, I noticed this when I listened to the Mayor of London talking, most of the big cities of the world now have resilience officers. It isn't just a clever bit of creating a new role. It's really saying we need to be clear in our own mind how folks can bounce back from the most impossible of circumstances. Let's be clear about this covenant hope, recognizing God's covenant of love. God's covenant is not an agreement of circumstance. It was and is about God's liberating power to change lives and change the circumstances of our world. Love is a motivating power. Love is able to do what we could not do by ourselves. It is the basis of everything that we stand for here. It is the love of God set free into the personal circumstances of people's lives. This is not sloppy, sentimental religion, but deep, meaningful faith. It's love understood in the context of his justice. It's love which can help to remake us when we feel that things are falling apart. When we consider God's love We acknowledge that it can transform our lives. I remind you of the words of Isaiah, another of those great Old Testament prophets, who talked about us being able to mount up with wings as eagles, to run and not grow weary, to walk and never faint. God doesn't give up on his chosen people. The very nature of chosen takes us back to that. The God that will walk with us and stand with us. Far too many people, when they see a word like chosen, use it in that selective sense. When I read the New Testament and when I read the Old Testament, this sense of being chosen is of a God who will walk through us, whatever the circumstances are that we find ourselves. They have all-time consequences in our lives. When we drive around New South Wales, I like to explore the radio channels. Now, when you get out of the city, they are somewhat different. It's not that long ago that we listened to one program dominated by the music of the 60s to the 80s. So we had a marvelous journey as we listened to this music. And having not long before that listened to a live concert of Joan Baez at the Opera House, we were very much tuned in to what the music was all about. Bob Dylan and Johnny Cash, two of the most amazing people to have ever recorded records when you listen to their voices. But it wasn't their voices, was it? It's what happened in their lives and who they were that communicated so much that was real. Johnny Cash, who battled serious drug and alcohol abuse, and once said this: you build on failure, you use it as a stepping stone, close the door to the past, don't try to forget the mistakes, but you don't dwell on them. You don't let them have your energy. You don't try to forget the mistakes, but you don't let them control your lives. You don't let them have your time or any of your space. And I thought maybe I struggle with some of his songs, but I understood that and what it meant. All hope-filled Christians have two things in common. They have failed in the past, and yet they've never let those previous failures stop them. G.K. Chesterton, the great lay Christian, his writings and ideas of something of a renaissance. If you watch Father Brown, you'll see that Father Brown's stories are all based on G.K. Chesterton's writings. They've been so successful that they've actually started writing more G.K. Chesterton stories than Chesterton ever wrote himself, because they're that good. And in those stories, you see something of the transformation. But this is the one thing Chesterton said, which I will never, never forget. He said Jesus promised his disciples three things. One, that they would be completely fearless, absurdly happy, and constantly in trouble. And I thought, you've got it right, Chesterton. You're speaking into the reality of what it means for us to be disciples. When General Colin Powell was the United States Secretary of State, this was in the days, incidentally, when they used to have press conferences. It's a new idea that I'm hoping they reintroduce out there again. And Powell was in a situation where people were asking him all kinds of questions because he was retiring. And one person asked him the question about his life. What kind of regrets have you got? Now, that would be a penetrating question for somebody in public life, especially if they had traveled through some of those difficult, challenging times that he had to do. And his answer was this: what good are regrets? They slow you down. Regrets cause you to fail to pay attention to the future. His answer was even more fascinating when he continued: so I never keep a log or make an inventory of my regrets. I move on. I thought that was really quite penetrating from somebody of his standing. Let's explore our covenant. Jeremiah is of chief importance in stating a new covenant. But we must ask what it says to us. It's not based on outward circumstances or observances. It reaches beyond nation and community to profound personal truth. That's what the covenant in Jeremiah was about. It wasn't just about personal lives, it was about community and engagement. And if we ourselves here at Wesley Mission are coming at the beginning of year and all we're wanting to do is feel good about ourselves, well, that might be helpful to some extent. But it's much more than that. It offers us the opportunity for a change of heart. I love those words in Jeremiah, a new heart, a new privilege to start again. Our covenant making requires a frame of mind. Our covenant is not about success, but glorious engagement with God. You know, one of our members here at Wesley Mission, I enjoy sometimes going into people's office and talking with them, had in their office, and no longer work for us, but had in their office a beautiful picture of Helen Keller when she arrived at Sydney Airport. It's decades ago now, but she arrived there, and if you don't know anything about her, I would say, whatever else, don't forget Helen Keller as though she's just somebody from the past who has no sense to speak to us today. She once said this: without the ability to speak in the same way that we are able to do that, walking with a friend in the dark is better than walking alone in the light. And I thought that was wonderful. Walking in those places with somebody, even if it's difficult. Hold nothing back. He didn't. This is so important as far as I'm concerned. So important to know that God didn't call us to give a small part of our life to him. He called us to give everything that we have to him. Don't hold anything back, for he didn't. Each time we share together in the beginning of a year, or every time we break bread, or every time we come together as a community and we do things that are holy and true, we have the opportunity to give. Hold nothing back, he didn't. Take nothing back. Receive everything that he's got to give. Our God is a God who gives. So however tired we are, however energized we might find that we have got taking from us so much resources, give and give and give again as he has given to you. Look forward, onwards and upwards. This becomes the frame of reference, it seems to me, of the whole of the way we live. We make this covenant together. We recognize that even the Lone Ranger had Tonto. So we need to be together. This is not about individuality alone. It is about a covenant that we make together in our Lord Jesus Christ. The whole of our living. We make this sense of belonging together. One of the most striking gospel verses lies at the outset of the ministry of Jesus when we read it at the beginning of Mark's gospel. Follow me, and I will make you become fishers of women and men. That which changes us. None of the disciples would have been our first choice. Even if we had a list of what they did, we'd have said, I don't know about them. In some ways, they were the most unlikely of people. Jesus Christ did not and does not focus upon what people are like, but what they can become. It's not what you've done. It's not what you have. It's what in God's grace you can become as he changes your life. Allow Jesus' promise to give shape to you as you move to the future. Many of our airlines have frequent flyer programs. You know, I still have some from Braniff Airlines. Braniff Airlines shut down in 1982. The Big Orange, I think they used to call themselves, from Texas. And the company closed, but their air miles count for nothing. I do have some with Continental Airlines. They're exciting because they look as though they're thousands. And then, of course, as you know, you can buy gifts with your airline points. And I think when I last looked, when they were still operating in terms of miles, I could buy a kettle with all the air miles I got. But we're all frequent flyers, all of us. Frequent flyers in what we bring to the table, in what is our beginning of year experience. We're frequent flyers around this theatre in terms of our experience of life. We're frequent flyers when it comes to expressing compassion to those in need. We're frequent flyers when we have to face the difficulties that we've had to learn to overcome. There's no better time of the year to review, to reassess, and to look again at the call of Jesus Christ upon our lives. We need to be sure that we're not dominated by the rear view mirror. Where we live is a fairly long house drive. There were two things when I came to live in that house. The first was there's a large dip, and I used to think we'll do well if we managed to get through all our years here without falling down there. Please don't remind me about this sometime during the year. And the other was it was a long drive down. Now, it's okay in the light, but if I've got to go out at night and back down, it's very difficult. And I rely on that mirror to be able to help me down the drive. But we can't live our lives constantly looking in the rear view mirror. We need to be looking ahead. Henry James was an American-British author who came from a strong academic family. He's the brother of William James, who was a psychologist and philosopher. My memorable quote from him is this: 3 things, great academic, 3 things in human life are important. The first is to be kind. The second is to be kind. And the third, you've already guessed it, is to be kind. He knew how important that was. Spelt out in human relationship, spelt out in service, issuing forth in Christian discipleship. Well, the covenant prayer that John Wesley and those early Methodists crafted is the one before you now. Now I'll read it. All I invite you to do is quietly make it your own. I am no longer my own, but yours. Put me to what you will. Rank me with whom you will. Put me to doing. Put me to suffering. Let me be employed for you or laid aside for you, exalted for you or brought low for you. Let me be full. Let me be empty. Let me have all things. Let me have nothing. I freely and wholeheartedly yield all things to your pleasure and disposal. Amen. Amen. I've actually taken the liberty of typing that out. So there are copies if you want to take one away and put it with whatever you do. I have a number of papers that help me in devotions through the year. There might be something that there might help you as you seek to live that life which is Christ. God has called us into a new relationship to renew and restore our covenant with God. Amen.